Okay, hello everyone. I'm Matt Sapienza. I'm the Senior Vice Chancellor and Chief Financial Officer at the City University of New York. So welcome to CUNY, and welcome to one of the finest institutions that we have in CUNY, Baruch College. And so I want to thank the folks at Baruch for hosting us tonight, and thank all of you for coming out during the polar vortex and being here. I mean, listen, what's there to complain about? It's 16 degrees. It was 0 degrees when I left this morning. So now it's a balmy 16. Nothing to complain about. All's good. So welcome, and I want to thank the Community Service Society for putting together this event. I'm really excited and looking forward to it. We have outstanding panelists here this evening, and I want to thank them for their willingness to serve on it and to talk about this really critical issue about student debt. We're very proud at CUNY for the work that we're doing in this area, but we know that more needs to be done, and we always need to remain vigilant. At the university, we try our best to keep tuition low. At this institution, Baruch College, and all of our other four-year schools, the tuition for a full-time resident student is $6,730 per year. So we're incredibly low in terms of our tuition. We're also very fortunate to, here in New York State, we have the incredible tuition assistance program, the TAP program. We're very, very grateful for the Excelsior Scholarship Program that was enacted last year. We have City Council merit scholarships. So our tuition combined with all of this aid, including federal Pell Grants, result in 75% of our graduates last year graduated with no debt at all. It's something we're very proud of, but we know we need to continue to work on. And about 65% of our students, because of federal and state and city support, didn't pay any tuition last year. They attended tuition free. So while we're proud of that, we know that a lot of work still needs to be done in that area, and we're committed to doing so. So again, welcome to CUNY, welcome to Baruch College. Thank you to our panelists for being here. And with that, I'm going to introduce the president of CSS, David Jones.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor. Very kind of you to help us get this wonderful space to have this discussion. I'm Dave Jones. I'm the president of the Community Service Society. We've been working for about 175 years on issues around poverty and low-income New Yorkers. We use research and advocacy, litigation and direct service, and innovative program models to address income inequality and bring down barriers preventing New Yorkers from achieving their full economic potential. We put together an impressive panel of speakers this evening to examine the $90 billion debt crisis that affects New York State alone. It's part of the trillion-plus amounts that's owed nationwide, but we have a huge problem in the state of New York. And we see this problem at CSS firsthand. Through our financial coaching core program, we work one-on-one with clients looking for help managing their student loan debt. Poor and communities of color are particularly vulnerable to student loan debt because they typically have higher rates of delinquency and default. It's particularly true of African American women, by the way, as the group that is particularly hard hit. Not surprisingly, as the student loan crisis rages on, regretfully, the Trump administration has taken steps to empower, and I say empower, not rein in the loan servicing industry, an industry that is making billions in profits off the interests on those student loans. We're here this evening because we all agree that New Yorkers need to help fight back against deceptive loan service industry practices. And that's why CSS is proposing the creation of an independent statewide student loan consumer assistance program that would offer unbiased information, direct personalized assistance, and where needed, legal assistance to individuals young and old, because many parents co-sign. I don't know about you, I co-signed my kid, struggling with student debt. The program, which would complement proposed state legislation to regulate and license the loan servicing industry and hold them accountable for misleading borrowers, would help position New York as a leader in this fight against student loan debt. not to mention present a stark contrast with the federal government's most destructive policies of protecting predatory lenders at the expense of borrowers. We prepared a short video just to give you a taste of what people are being confronted with, and we're going to dim the lights, so don't worry, it doesn't mean there's a power failure or anything, but to see what it really is like.
My name is Cherise Ferguson. Well, originally I wanted to go to school to be a teacher. That was my goal. I love working with kids. At the time, I felt like I was a big kid myself, so I could relate. I was so excited about getting accepted. I wasn't thinking about how much that loan, how much it would affect me today. So I kept saying the ends would justify, the amount I'll have to pay in the long run. At least I have my degree. That's what I was thinking of. I started working somewhere else. Tried to pay back the loan little by little as I was able to, and I was working and they were taking money out of my checks automatically at one point, and it just seemed like it wasn't doing anything. So it just got worse. It really felt as if I'd never be able to pay it back, and I felt like I was being treated like a criminal because I couldn't pay it back, and no matter how much I tried, it just wasn't working out. I still have the ultimate goal to go back to school, but because of the loan, it's held me back a lot. I'd given up on going back. I really did feel like it was a lost cause at one point, but I'm grateful that I'm now on the track, back on track.
Cherise came to me in February as she was just another client that signed up for the services, and she walked in and she clearly had this very large, or at least what she anticipated to be what she felt was a very large student loan issue looming over her. Her student loans were in default. She was not working at the time. She had been dealing with this Department of Education debt collection agency that was demanding certain things of her that she could not do. And so the process started there. And the first step was really to get on the phone with the debt collector and sort of see what was going on. And sure enough, they were demanding that she pay, I think, something like $300 over a period of a couple of months just to even start the process of curing the default. And they offered her no other options beyond that. So after that meeting, I think the change in her demeanor was pretty substantial. I think she felt like she finally had somebody that was advocating on her behalf, and that she knew that these loans were out of default, and she knew what she had to do to satisfy the terms of the loan going forward.
It's just restored my hope and a desire again to go back and to finish college.
Just to give you a sense of what people are up against, we wanted to do that, but I now have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker. Seth Frotman is the founder and executive director of the Student Borrowers Protection Center. As many of you know, he previously served as assistant director and student loan ombudsman for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where he led the federal government's effort to reform student loan repayment systems and protect millions and I say millions, of Americans with student debt. During his tenure, the Bureau returned more than $750 million to harmed student loan borrowers across the country. But alarmed by the sweeping changes to the Bureau under the Trump administration that were hurting families and minimizing the struggles of average loan holders, Zeth resigned in August 2018 in protest. It's not easy in this administration to take anything on, but taking on the Trump administration, it takes an enormous amount of courage, in my view. In his resignation letter, he stated that under President Trump, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau had been used to, quote, serve the wishes of the most powerful financial companies in America, end quote. By underscoring how the student loan system takes advantage of borrowers and operates without proper oversight and accountability, Zeth has referred to as the student loan whistleblower and student loan watchdog in the press. And that's why we're so honored to have him as our keynote tonight, because this is the essential leadership of the national effort to roll back what's happening in the country. Zeth, thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for that kind introduction and for your steadfast leadership in this city. You are a true visionary, and we all benefit from your efforts. I also want to thank the entire staff at the Community Service Society of New York for putting on this critically important event, and also the amazing work you do every day, from fighting to protect workers' rights to increasing access to health care and everything in between. CSS has spent the last 175 years devoted to building a more just and equitable New York. Its effectiveness at incorporating student debt into this mission is a model more of us should follow. Over the last 20 years, I've had the opportunity to serve at all levels of government. I've worked on everything from military consumer protection to LGBTQ rights. And somewhere along the way, I became, quote, the student loan guy. So how did that happen? At the end of that long, winding road, the simple answer was 44 million people needed someone on their side. I have traveled all across this country talking to these people. I've spent countless hours reading thousands of complaints. I've heard firsthand the horror stories of how student debt wrecks lives, how thousands of dollars in debt grows into hundreds of thousands, all because someone wanted to go to college. Across all of these stories, there is one unifying theme. How could this have happened when everything they did was everything they were supposed to do? These people are just like you and me. These are the people we've known our whole lives, people who are simply trying to get ahead, earn a better life for their family by doing exactly what society had asked of them. Go to school, get the degree, regardless of the cost, only to have their lives and livelihoods, and often their families and communities, ruined in the process. I'm sure you've heard the numbers before, but I think they are worth repeating. Today, more than 44 million student loan borrowers owe more than $1.5 trillion in student loan debt. 8 million of them are in default. 5 million more are on their way. Last year, more than 1 million borrowers defaulted on their loan, joining the million plus who defaulted the year before that, and the year before that, and the year before that. In fact, every 28 seconds, another student loan borrower defaults on their loan. That's every 28 seconds of every hour, every day, every year. And it's not just those in default. It's also millions of folks making their payments while barely scraping by. This is about real people with ruined lives and wrecked financial futures, all suffering because of the system that we built. A system built on the notion that higher education is always the great equalizer, regardless of cost. A system where there is seemingly no price too high and no burden too heavy for the millions of students we churn through its gears. a system that seems to explain away any data point that begins to dismantle its wobbly foundation. This system is premised on a single and singularly misguided myth, and it goes something like this. Maria works hard her entire life to go to college. She applies to a public university in state. She is thrilled when she gets in. A few weeks later, she checks her mailbox and sees her financial aid letter. As Maria scans the letter, she realizes that the future she strove for, the future that we insisted was the best path for her, the only path for her, would require her to take on debt. And not just a little debt, $30,000 in debt. Like most of her peers, Maria signs on the dotted line because without these loans, she can't go to school. She has no other choice. This is not some teachable moment. This isn't some opportunity for her to cut corners or tighten some hypothetical belt in order to pay her tuition. For Maria, the choice is binary. Take on an unfathomable amount of debt to go to school or don't go to school at all. This isn't about personal responsibility. It's about the collective decisions we all made that led Maria to the point where her only choice is no choice at all. Now, 5 years after she opened the letter in her mailbox, Maria walks across the stage, throws her cap in the air, all with $30,931 awaiting her in repayment. And sadly, Maria's story is not unique. It is replicated hundreds of thousands of times, year after year, all across this country, in big cities like New York and Los Angeles, and in all of the small towns in between. But wait, you say, Maria is now a college graduate. So what if she owes 30 grand in debt? She's going to make, quote, $1 million in her lifetime compared to a non-college graduate because of that degree, because of that debt. That supposed justification, that mythical $1 million, is the sole factor we use in evaluating Maria's success. How much more does she make compared to the barista she grabs coffee from on the way to her job? For too many in the higher education policy world, that's the only thing that matters. This is the only metric by which we gauge whether public policy works. It is irrelevant to them that this spread exists, not because Maria's life has gotten better, but because for those without a degree, life has gotten worse. None of that matters to them. Maria and her mythical $1 million is a resounding policy success. These people tell those of us worried about the fallout from student debt, folks like me, and I am guessing folks like you, that we need to back off, that this is what success looks like. They say that, in fact, we should be encouraging more Marias, regardless of the cost. They are dangerously wrong. Because Maria's story doesn't end when she throws her cap in the air. Far from it. The reality is, Maria is working at a job that hasn't seen real wage growth in over a decade and lives in an apartment with rent that increases 10% each year. She does this while juggling childcare costs and healthcare premiums that grow exponentially. And on top of all of that, she must find a way to pay her $350 student loan payment each month. And speaking of those student loans, statistically, Maria will struggle to pay them back. As a borrower of color, a decade into repayment, she is still likely to owe more than she took out. In fact, her chances of defaulting on her student debt and having her financial future destroyed in the process is 5 times higher than her white peers. Maria's student debt also means she is less likely to get an advanced degree. She is less likely to pursue a career she actually wants. She is less likely to serve in her community. Maria's debt also means that she will earn less over the course of her life than someone without student debt. She will have a worse credit profile, meaning that all the other things she needs to live, a car loan, a mortgage, credit cards, will all be more expensive. And it's not limited to her monthly budget. Maria will invest less in her retirement account. She will be less likely to buy a home. And if she ever does, she is likely to have a smaller down payment, meaning more of her already small paycheck will be siphoned off as interest and insurance to a Wall Street bank. And it's not limited to Maria's life. Maria's student debt means she is less likely to get married or start a family. And if she does, her spouse is also likely to have student debt. Their collective debt means they will accrue $250,000 less in wealth than the family down the street without it. But it's not just them. It's not even just their generation that will be impacted. Maria will be less likely to save for her own child's education. And when Maria's child goes to college, she will need to take out her own loans, and the cycle starts again. Now take Maria's story and multiply it 44 million times. That is where this gets scary. A growing body of evidence suggests that millions of Americans are experiencing crises just like Maria's. Individual lives are disrupted, families become buried under the financial consequences of unmanageable debt, and this devastation ripples across their communities. Your community, my community, Maria's community. What we are doing to Maria and to the millions more just like her, what we are doing to the nation in the form of debt-fueled higher education is driving the systemic racial and economic inequality that is tearing this country apart. That is why those who argue that Maria is a success story are more than short-sighted. They are dangerously and deceptively wrong. I want to be clear about one thing. Taking each prospective college student individually, I know that we would all look at that financial aid letter and tell that student to take the same path and take on that same debt. But that is not the point. That is a tired argument from an increasingly irrelevant crowd. We need to be better than that. It is our job as policymakers and as advocates to be better than that. We cannot continue to judge success by pitting Maria and her debt burden against the horrific outcomes of the non-college educated labor force. We cannot tell Maria that she should be content, or worse, grateful, that she is not like, quote, that guy over there. That somehow, despite all of the struggles she will be forced to endure and the impact on her family and her community, her outcome is something that she should embrace and others should emulate. It is our job to ensure that millions of people do not take the least worst option. It is our job to see the bigger picture, the totality of these actions, where the collective weight of the burden we have pushed on millions is tearing at the fabric of our society. It is our job to understand that we have failed Maria, and we have failed millions just like her. And it is our job to do better. And the first way we do this is by ending the dangerous notion that student debt is unavoidable, a necessary precondition to reap the benefits of higher education. Through $1 trillion sleight of hand, we have created a world where the benefits of higher education are only accessible through debt. But student debt is not a given. It is not a necessary evil. We cannot succumb to the wishes of those who have not only resigned themselves to this broken system, but have also asked us to accept this as the new normal. It is not. We cannot listen to those who explicitly or implicitly think that this is the only way, that this is the best that Maria and those like her can hope for. It is not. We cannot believe that the only way for Maria to achieve the American dream is through debt-fueled higher education. It is not. We must find ways to end this cycle. We cannot accept the struggles that we know will befall Maria, that will befall this state and this country. We cannot accept that there is no will for the investment that allows her to get a degree without a mountain of debt and decades of despair, because there most certainly is. Which brings me to my second point. Some of the most powerful and important voices for change are nowhere to be found, and their absence is striking. We cannot claim to use privilege to fight inequality without attacking the disparate and devastating burden of student debt. We cannot claim to care about poverty and ignore how student debt is destroying our most vulnerable communities. We cannot claim to see equal value in all lives without demanding better for the generation we forced this crisis upon. We can no longer tout access without considering the aftermath. The fallout from the student debt crisis doesn't have boundaries, so neither can we. Which brings me to my last point. There is a generational reckoning coming, both to Congress and to state houses. And this is what the fierce defenders of the status quo do not understand. Those entering the halls of Congress and state houses are younger and more diverse than ever before. And they know Maria. They know intuitively what student debt does to her family, and to her community. They know her because many of them are her. And they are not resigned to accepting the least worst option. They do not define success by comparing their lives to the barista down the street. They do not tolerate the notion of student debt as a necessary evil. Simply put, the days of student debt as good debt are over. But getting there won't be easy. It's etched into American lore that the torch gets passed between generations. But that's not true. To paraphrase one of my favorite books, make no mistake, power is won, grasped. It is never handed over willingly. It is wrestled away by organizational force and political skill. And that is true now more than ever. It must be wrestled away from those who have not been forced to bear the scars, from those who have made a career urging us to accept the new normal using a degree paid for with pocket change a lifetime ago, from those who spend their days in spreadsheets and debate forums but haven't actually talked to a person like Maria in decades. And that is why your work matters. That's why what CSS is doing matters. That's why the organizing matters. That's why making student debt part of your mission matters. For the organizational force, for the political skill to grasp the torch for Maria and for the millions more like her. Thank you very much.
Okay, now for our panel who've been waiting, very willingly. And I'd like to introduce the moderator, Tara Siegel-Bernard of the New York Times, who handles financial matters in the Times, personal finance, and she's going to take over this panel, and ultimately we'll have questions afterwards, because I think many are coming. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thanks so much for having me. Welcome, everyone. I'm happy to lead what I expect to be a really engaging conversation. Everyone, before we start, there's a few housekeeping items. Everybody should have a biography of our panelists in the program. And you should also have a card on your seat because you'll be taking questions later. So if you have a question, you could write it down on the card and somebody will come around to collect it. And if you would like, you also have the alternative of speaking at one of the microphones on each side of the room. So you can step up and speak as well. So without further ado, I'm going to ask the panelists to briefly introduce themselves. And then we'll jump into our discussion. So maybe we'll start with you, Kavya.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kavya Bagal, and I'm currently a Master in City Planning candidate at Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Department of Urban Studies and Planning. A mouthful, I know. Prior to this, I was working as a senior research analyst at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, and one of the things that I worked on was the Mapping Student Debt Project in collaboration with Generation Progress and HigherEd.Debt.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Hulsman. I'm the Associate Director of Policy and Research at Demos. We are a public policy organization in New York and Washington, looking for ways to make America more equal, have an equal say in our democracy and an equal chance in our economy. And I've worked on student loan issues and college affordability issues for far too long now.
Hi, everyone. I'm Senator Kevin Thomas. Before getting into the state Senate, I was a legal services attorney working in the Bronx. I ran a clinic called the Volunteer Lawyer for a Day, which saw a lot of student loan cases. I've defended quite a number of student loan borrowers. If you Google National Collegiate Student Loan Trust, Sally Mae, I'm one of the attorneys that was able to beat them in court. And I decided to run for office because of the way the Trump administration has been letting student loan borrowers down. So now I'm here. I'm the chair of the Consumer Protection Committee. I'm also on the Judiciary and a number of other committees. Just on Monday, we just passed a bill to regulate student loan servicers here in the state. Got a lot of pushback from student loan servicers lobbyists, but I won. So just waiting for the Assembly to pass it and to get on the floor for a vote. So happy to take any questions later on.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ken Zabrowski. I'm a New York State Assemblyman, and I chair the Committee on Banks in the Assembly. I represent Rockland County. I know we have at least one Rockland County resident in the... I sponsor several bills, including the bill the Senator just mentioned, and have passed several of them in the democratically controlled assembly, and we are thrilled to have new partners in the Senate to be able to work on a lot of these issues. I myself am an attorney also by trade, and just so you all know, my wife and I both also continue to pay our student loans, as Mr. Frotman just mentioned. So happy to be involved in this discussion today.
Good evening. My name is Nicole Perry. I'm the Deputy Commissioner for the Office of Financial Empowerment at the New York City Department of Consumer Affairs. At the Department of Consumer Affairs, we enforce key consumer protection, licensing, and workplace laws. But specifically, my office, the Office of Financial Empowerment, is really focused on the financial health of New Yorkers. How can we educate, empower, and protect New Yorkers so that they can take control of their financial resources and that they have the tools to better manage their finances. We, through our office, provide free one-on-one financial coaching and counseling to New Yorkers. We also organize the city's free tax preparation services. And, you know, our focus is really on helping New Yorkers reduce debt, build savings, improve their credit, and connect to safe and affordable financial products and services. And so this work around student loan debt hits home, but also we see that our clients are struggling with debt in general and student loan debt in particular. We've released 2 research studies on student loan debt. We've been out in the community talking to folks to hear what their pain points are, and we think there is a key role that the city can play in addressing student loan debt.
I'm Seth.
Excellent. So let's jump right in. I'm going to direct questions at specific panelists, but if you have something meaningful to add afterwards, feel free to chime in, because the more this is a discussion, the better it will be. So I thought we'd start out by painting a picture of who is most affected by this problem. We know that, according to one statistic, about 60% of bachelor degree grads from public and private nonprofits graduate with $28,000 in debt. And there's an often cited maxim that says, well, if you earn at least that much, you can manage that. It should be fine. So, but when you peel back all the layers, we see that it's not that simple. And it's a lot more complicated than the averages. So I thought we'd start by maybe looking at, who's burdened in New York City, Nicole. Who's feeling this here and why?
So in December 2017, we released a report in collaboration with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And what we found is that 1 million adult New Yorkers have student loan debt, and that's about 15% of New York City adults, and they had a total of $34.8 billion in student loan debt. Some people might take those numbers and think, okay, that's not, maybe that's good or bad. That's not saying much. I think for us, what stood out is the point of who was being adversely impacted. So when we started to take a closer look at the research, we found that it was primarily borrowers in lower income neighborhoods that were in default and delinquency on their student loans. So we looked at it, and 20% of borrowers in the lowest income neighborhoods were either delinquent or in default on their student loans versus 8% in the highest income neighborhoods. We also saw that of those that were delinquent or defaulted, a lot of those low-income borrowers had balances of $5,000 or less. And so we think about, what are the implications of being in default on your student loans? What impact does that have on your credit? How does that hinder you from other things? We saw that someone wanted to go back to school but was unable to do that because they had that debt. You are not able to save as you would like to. You may not be able to start your small business. So thinking about all of the financial health implications of having this student loan debt was very concerning for our office and made us want to address this issue. But then when we looked a little deeper, we saw the Bronx, Brooklyn struggling, having some of the highest default and delinquency rates. We also saw that those residents of Black and Latino were also struggling with student loan debt. I think it was just a lot of interesting data that was coming out of the research. One example was that 15.1% of those student loan debt, of those individuals having student loan debt and collections, the majority were in all majority Hispanic neighborhoods, and 15.8% in majority Black neighborhoods versus 8.5% in majority white neighborhoods. So we saw the income component and the inequities, but also the racial component, and just thinking about what we already know about the racial wealth gap, and again, using student loan or higher education as a way to, as a path to upward mobility. It seemed like it was actually exacerbating the problem instead of helping to solve the problem.
Got it. Yeah, I recently saw a statistic from Brookings Institution that said that Black bachelor grads were defaulting at 5 times the rate of white grads, and there were just some other really astounding statistics that get at the issue that you were just discussing. Kavya, you've also been analyzing a lot of this data.
Well, I'd love to jump in and say that, yes, what we see in the data on the Mapping Student Debt Project at the very granular local level is something that is mirrored in the data that you see as well. We had 3 key findings. One, which you already stated, is that low-income communities experience the highest rates of student loan delinquency, and they do have the small loan balances. The second, again, was around minority communities, communities of color, who do have the highest rates of student loan delinquency, and we see that the delinquency rates are higher in those African American and Latino communities. But what's more, we found that middle class or middle income African American and Latino communities are the ones who are hit hardest by student loan delinquency, which really tells you the story again, that it's those people who are trying to climb to the middle class that are basically being fed this idea that higher education is the promise to unlocking the pathway to the middle class. And that's a really frustrating narrative to keep hearing and seeing fail. And then the last finding that I think kind of highlights how impactful student debt is around the student loan debt burdens, which you can see in the maps that are on the screen. Debt burden is highest generally in areas where employment is low, and so when you have a low employment rate, you're seeing higher student debt burden. But it's also extremely high in areas where average loan balances are high. And so what this means is it's basically, if you're at the bottom of the spectrum or the top of the spectrum, student debt and student debt burden is something that affects everyone. And so it's this massive crisis that's happening around basically things like home ownership, things like marriage rates, things like childcare, all of these other burdens that people have to pay off. I think that there's a challenge when coming to balance it with the student debt.
Thank you. Seth, was there anything that you wanted to add about the kind of the struggle before it hits the numbers?
Yeah. So I think you asked like the toughest question, I think, to start, which is unfair, but so I think and a ton of people on this panel could weigh in on this just as well as I could, is no one's really landed on what it means to have for student loan borrowers to be struggling, right? So there's a lot of talk in Washington that the really only piece of the problem is those borrowers who are delinquent on their loans or are in default on their loans, so they're just not making payments. And I think that's entirely too quaint, too narrow of a definition, because you're starting to see more and more data every day, and I think the maps around debt burden kind of bear this out, is there are millions of people who are paying their bill every month, but their student loan is having an enormously detrimental impact on the rest of their financial lives. And I think DC is still very much grappling with this problem, which is this is supposedly the gateway to the middle class, but when you start looking at more and more of the research coming out, the struggle is a lot more than just those who are failing to pay, and the ramifications both at the individual household level, but at the societal level are enormous in terms of driving income inequality, racial inequality. So I think you really landed on what is the unacceptable level of student loan borrowers struggling? And without figuring that out, it's really hard to kind of land on the solutions.
So for the next theme I thought we'd explore is, how or where does the existing structure or system fail borrowers who are struggling to make ends meet? My colleagues have written about loans that were designed to fail, lawsuits against loan servicers who are, accused of recommending options that benefit them and not their clients. So Mark, I thought maybe you could weigh in on this, and when do problems begin to snowball for borrowers? What happens when they turn to the servicers for assistance? Where are we failing them?
Sure. I would argue that we're failing them from a very basic policy design at the very beginning. This is not a system that if you were starting from scratch and you said, this is how we want to finance education in this country, and I brought you how we do it now, you would rightfully laugh me out of the room, right? You would say that's insane. And for a long time, student loans were not the primary way people financed college, right? I mean, it wasn't until the mid-1990s that you had a better chance of borrowing for a degree than not borrowing for a degree. Student loans were sort of the purview of upper middle class students who could cobble together a little bit after they had some, grant and scholarship aid and tuition was low enough that they could pay for college. But now we've sort of, due to some inertia and due to just some actual genuine policy choices that Seth mentioned, where people thought that student debt was automatically good debt, we have made it so that borrowing is universal, right? We've made it so that in order to get the degree, particularly if you're a working class student, you're a Black or a Latinx student, you basically have to borrow. And what that's done is that has put students and borrowers at the mercy of private companies who are either collecting debt or servicing debt, and we sort of rely and hope that they're going to service that debt properly, right? So servicers, you would think they'd offer, sort of the best financial advice for students. They'd get them into the repayment plans that make sense for them, that the federal government has created for them, but often they don't, right? They fall down on the job. Anyone who's dealt with their student loan servicer on the phone, and Seth can talk about the millions of complaints that the CFPB got about student loan servicers, there's a lot of evidence showing that they have steered borrowers into things that are not super helpful for them. So you can make monthly payments as low as $0 if you are making poverty level wages, but servicers often don't tell borrowers about that, right? These are government contractors at the end of the day. They should be doing the public service that we have contracted them to do, and they don't often do it. And there should be some accountability, or maybe a bureau that is in charge of oversight.
Kevin, did you want to weigh in on that?
Oh, yeah. So in my introduction, I talked about a bill that was passed through my committee. It's to regulate student loan servicers, exactly what my colleague here was just talking about, misrepresentation, basically leading the student loan borrower into something they should not go into, and then they get into a default, and then they get garnished, etc. So this bill would basically tell the student loan servicer that you need to have a license, and they're going to be licensed by the Department of Financial Services. And any complaints, they can obviously go to the CFPB. They can also make a complaint to DFS, and DFS, that's the Department of Financial Services, and they would then investigate, and they have the option of suspending the servicer's license. And this is big. This is good for New York because it holds them accountable. No one has been able to regulate this industry. We've talked about how much of a loan burden Americans have. It's in 43 million lives. It's $1.3 trillion that they service, and the national government is not actually regulating them. They try, but they then let them down. So New York has to step up, and that's what this bill is going to do. Hopefully it gets passed in the Assembly.
Well, I wrote the bill, and we have passed it in years past. There is something, though, that happened that we have to consider. So there was a federal court case in the District of Columbia, where a judge did partially say that the District of Columbia, who has one of these laws, was preempted. by the federal government, which was obviously concerning. In years past, this was something, as we debated it in the Assembly, that often came, aren't you preempted? And we believe that we are on pretty solid legal ground that these companies do have to comply with general consumer protection laws. So what does that mean? It means like you can't misapply payments, you can't defraud borrowers, the types of things you would expect to be the law. However, this judge did say that we are preempted in some ways. So what we have to do now is sort of figure out, and I believe we can do it, to what extent, how far did that judge go, and how can we craft a bill, which I think we can, and me and Mr. Frotman were chatting right before we started, and there's a bunch of states that are in this situation right now to make sure that folks in New York can apply to their government, their state government, and not have to go to the morass of bureaucracy down in Washington, D.C., and quite frankly, I don't think an administration that we can count on, in order to get their basic consumer protections. When they see something odd come in one of their bills, who can they appeal to make sure that their payments are applied correctly? And then if they do go into default, that the company, the servicer, isn't steering them towards a repayment plan that is most profitable towards the servicer, but a repayment plan that makes the most sense for the borrower. At the end of the day, states should have that ability. I look forward to working with the Senator, Mr. Frotman, and everybody on this panel in order to get that done.
I think I just want to make one point. I think when the story of the student debt crisis, I think is really twofold. I think to Mark's point is the sheer amount of debt that we have forced an entire generation to take on. But I think the kind of lesser known story is we essentially dropped $1 trillion of consumer debt onto the backs of American families with no real plan or mechanism to actually oversee it. What we always said in my old job was, student loan borrowers have less protections, less oversight, and less accountability when they get ripped off, as compared to folks with mortgages, credit cards, and you name it. And I think this is exceedingly unfortunate, and there are very few good guys when it comes to the student loan morass. But these folks up here are the real heroes. The senator, the assemblyman, Nicole and her boss are thinking through how we no longer just rely on Washington to try to solve this mess. They never have and they never will. And these guys are doing the really hard work to figure out this kind of second bucket, which is you now have 44 million Americans, 2 million here in New York, who are really struggling. How do you think through how you use every tool at the state level, the municipal level, to stand up for them? And I think it's been great to watch New York really step up and be a leader on this, like so many other issues, because I think what can happen here can really be replicated nationwide and really effectuate change.
Can I just add? In addition to the messaging and also the oversight of student loan servicers, we also have seen the rise in predatory practices among for-profit schools. And that's something that our agency has been looking to tackle directly. I think in October, we announced a case that we were bringing against Berkeley regarding violations of the New York City Consumer Protection Law. And in our research that we did, when we looked at what were some of the indicators that would show borrowers being more vulnerable to student loan debt distress, there was a very positive correlation with attendance at a for-profit school. And then when you look at that deeper, you see a lot of the vulnerable populations that we've talked about attend for-profit schools at higher rates. So you see a lot of Black and Latino students attending for-profit schools. You also see students from households with lower incomes attending for-profit schools, and also older non-traditional students. And so that only works to, again, exacerbate the issue. But I think that oversight of for-profit schools, or at least the increase in predatory practices among for-profit schools, is something where we need to look at.
Excellent. Just going back to preemption, one of my colleagues had reported that, after Betsy DeVos, the education secretary, started scaling back consumer protections, at least a half a dozen states started to crack down on all these abusive lending practices by the companies that administer the loan program. And then she turned around and tried to stop them. So can we talk just a little bit more about the roadblocks, the challenges? Seth, you've been mucking around in that.
So she's certainly trying. I think with like every ounce of energy, she is essentially trying to say that student loan companies are above the law, that traditional tools that have existed for decades, generations, such as state consumer protection statutes, the ability of entities like DFS to license and oversee student loan companies. The current administration, Betsy DeVos, has argued that those don't exist, that student loan borrowers, the 44 million student loan borrowers in America, and their financial future is in her hands and her hands alone. And that is a petrifying proposition. So I think the only redeeming thing about this is they're losing pretty resoundingly. So there's been a host of states who have sued companies like Navient, like Fed Loan Servicing or FIA, if you guys have those. And in numerous instances, there's actually been quite a remarkable thing where the United States Department of Justice, on behalf of the Education Department, is showing up in courtrooms around the country arguing that state attorney generals and state banking regulators literally have no ability to stop these companies from ripping off those individual states' constituents and citizens. And what we've seen is good and bad, where there are like some pretty heroic attorney generals who are battling on this, which is good because they tend to be winning. I think the bad side is they are throwing up every sort of real roadblock for reform, which makes the work even more important. But one of the things that we spend a lot of time with at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is there's a whole lot of thought putting around student loans being different, like student loans being different than other forms of consumer credit. And I think that's the exact wrong way to go. Like every time we treat student loans different than other forms of consumer credit, it really ends up badly for student loan borrowers, right? We treat them differently in bankruptcy. We let student loan borrowers have their wages garnished. We take away their Social Security, their VA benefits. I got in a lot of trouble at the Bureau one time for saying, we treat student loan borrowers like tax cheats and deadbeat spouses. The only redeeming thing was it's true, so I couldn't get in that much trouble. But I think this is another example like that. Like these are exceedingly powerful financial institutions. Like the CEO of one of them made nearly $7 million last year and is slated supposedly to give $900 million in dividends and buybacks. Like these are not government entities. And these guys should be applauded for thinking through how we bring these companies in line with the traditional police powers and oversight mechanisms that states have always used.
And I thought we'd tackle the solutions that do exist. Solutions isn't quite the right word, but they're sort of, I think of them as Band-Aids because they're not really addressing the structural issue, why we ended up in this position to begin with, but they're these like back-end Band-Aids that we slap on everything to make the issue better, or make people able to continue with their lives to some extent. So I thought we'd start by talking about income-driven plans where your payments are based on your income. There are 4 types of them. We know it's really confusing. Are enough people using them? Where do the challenges lie when it comes to? That's probably one of the biggest tools in the toolbox, right? Mark? Yeah.
So income-driven repayment plans are, the federal government's had them for a long time, and most loans are federal loans. And they basically say, they're generally a good idea, right? That if your income is low, you can make payments based on sort of 10% of your income above poverty level wages, right? That's not a terrible plan. They're, as Tara alluded to, they are There are many plans. They are complicated. They rely on servicers to tell you about them and remind you to stay enrolled each year when your income might fluctuate. They have all kinds of potential to help some borrowers, but they are not a solution to the debt crisis. And while you're making very low monthly payments, your income or your interest is increasing on your loan. So the psychological impact of seeing a loan that is ballooning in balance, regardless of whether you're making your monthly payment, similar to if you made your monthly credit card or your minimum monthly credit card payment each month, that's huge. That's going to prevent you from investing in your future, buying a house. That's going to ding your credit. That's going to do all kinds of things financially or psychologically to you, right? So I think that people sort of advocate for income-driven repayment as this, oh, well, we should have zero defaults if we have income-driven repayment. But we have 8 million defaults, right? There's a reason they're not working. And the last thing I'll say about that IDR is a sort of a nuanced one, but the problem is kind of in the name for me. It's income driven. The income gap by race in this country is very big. The wealth gap by race in this country is much, much bigger. We know that people making the same level of income by race, about $50,000, have tremendously different wealth outcomes, right? This is history showing up in people's wallet. This is the racial wealth gap. A white family making $50,000 a year has 5 times the wealth as a black family making that amount. So that's a far different financial picture. So if we're making them pay $250 or $300 worth of their monthly income and monthly payments, it's going to be really different for a lot of people.
Right. There's also been the failure of the public service loan forgiveness program. We know that 28,000 people had applied as of last September, and 96 of them were approved. 70% were rejected, and we know that it's part of the reason, at least, is because it's incredibly confusing, and it almost seems by design. You need to be in the right kind of loan, you need to be the right kind of borrower, you need to be in the right kind of repayment plan. So is there any hope for these programs? We know that they did a significant amount of money to the program very recently. So is there any hope for this? Seth?
Sure. So I think there has to be, right? I think these were probably some of the toughest complaints we got from borrowers who 8 years into being a teacher in a Title I school would wake up one day, check in on their loan status, and think that they were 2 years away from forgiveness and being able to start their financial lives, only to realize that 8 years prior, their student loan servicer lied to them and they were in the wrong type of loan, and they essentially had to start from square one. So I think the main point, which is where we tend to fall out, is there are a lot of really interesting ideas, and a lot of the folks on this table, Mark being probably the lead, are thinking ways about how we shift away from debt-fueled higher education, right? I think one of the lines that one of our friends uses is like, this $1 trillion social experiment has massively failed, and we should just kind of realize that and move on. I think what we always argue is, so if you follow the presidential debates or any presidential election or talk to any elected official and someone asks them about student debt, their first response is always talking about debt-free college or making college more affordable for the next guy. After doing student loan work for 7 years, I could tell you nothing infuriates someone with student debt more than telling them that the solution to the problem is making college free for the next person. So I think we should think through the failures of these programs, not with the sole design of helping the next guy that comes through it. We can't just put aside 45 million people and kind of chalk them up as sacrificing them as a failed experiment. So that is a very long way to saying, I think we need to get these programs right, because for millions of people, this is the difference between a successful financial future and one that is not. So I think the tools around law enforcement, the tools around advocacy to try to make these programs work are important and can't be forgotten when we think through should we change IDR or PSLF or just generally debt finance education going forward.
On this point, one of the things that I'd really like to raise is the fact that to help borrowers now and people who are dealing with student debt crisis now, one of the really critical things that we need to do is address the labor market. When you have a weak labor market that's not able to support the people who are coming out with debt, and essentially they struggle with things like employment, they struggle with earnings, there's wage stagnation, as Seth mentioned before. There are, of course, the policy failures around the higher education, but then even more than that, probably the most powerful driver is discrimination. The most powerful driver that we see is discrimination in the labor market when it comes to hiring practices, wage practices, and the wealth gap. And so thinking about ways to resolve some of those labor market issues are really critical as well, to ensure that students today and people today who are dealing with student debt have the ability to move forward and make waves in life.
Yeah, can I just add, I think from our office's perspective, we've tried to in parallel, we still see the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program and income-driven repayment plans as an opportunity. They exist. We need to make sure that people are aware of those programs and are taking advantage of them where they may be able to benefit them and be helpful in the short term. I think in parallel, we want to address the systemic issues that are, again, hindering people from or weighing people down with student loan debt. So this is definitely something that has to be addressed from multiple angles. And, we are trying to make sure that people are aware of what their options are today. I think when we saw the news report about the number of people that were approved in that initial batch around the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, it was definitely disappointing, but also I could just imagine what it felt like to get that news that you were one of the people that now your loan was forgiven, and what would it mean for others to be able to experience that same feeling. And, we need to figure out what are the nudges, the reminders, how do we ensure that people are following the steps that they do need to follow, but then on the flip side, how do we ensure that loan servicers are still providing the right information to folks and leading them down the correct path?
One more, just to, go ahead.
In addition to the federal student loans, we also need to talk about the private student loan industry, where they basically give out loans at very high interest, all right? And they know, they do this for for-profit colleges because they know what's going to happen after. I've had a number of clients when I was in the legal services where they had something like Trump University. They went to some place like that, and the school just closed, and now they are, they have a lot of debt, and they're in court because they can't repay it. The student loan program was created to get people out of poverty. In this day and age, it's just keeping them there for years and years, and we need a solution to that. As a legal services attorney, I think that we should make it easier to file bankruptcy for student loans. All right, it's really hard to do that right now, so that would be like something that we should all be talking about.
Yeah, it's one pet peeve me and my journalist friends have is that when we see articles written that say it's not an option, that you cannot declare bankruptcy and discharge debt. You can. You can. It's just an adversary. You have to file a special proceeding.
Have to be disabled.
Yeah, right. Yes, yes. A sheer hopelessness, I think, is the bar. So yes, but I have something that I reported about a while ago was how a lot of the judges felt shackled by the law, by the case law, and they couldn't. And there were some, even in minority opinions, I believe, where they were speaking out and saying, the law we need to change this because this is no longer relevant for today's day and age. It was kind of fascinating to see them kind of protesting. So before we move on from this topic, I also just wanted to talk a little bit about free tuition. There's a lot of headlines about that, but I've seen a lot of criticism about how they really don't benefit low-income students. I don't know who might be best addressed. This question might be best addressed to, but does anybody want to weigh in on that?
Are you talking about the Excelsior program?
Or in general? I mean, yes, I have seen criticism of the Excelsior program.
Yeah, it doesn't work.
It's a start. I mean, it's a start. I think some of the criticism is that there's already sort of TAP awards and things that help really low-income students, and then there is a sector of students that would be helped by Excelsior. And then, of course, even at higher incomes, too often we're sort of considering a parent's income. So if you have two working parents that could be teachers making $127,000, that student gets nothing, and a family making $5,000 less suddenly gets a free tuition. That type of model just doesn't make sense. And there's also, though, something on the video which I think we haven't touched on. I think her name was Charisse. It mentioned how she was debt-free and going to a community college, and then was sort of duped into taking on additional debt. And I like to think of it as like affordability, information, and sort of regulation. And in the information period, letting students know, and I've had a piece of legislation for years, I don't think it's too much to ask for both our for-profit colleges, our not-for-profit private colleges, and our public institutions to provide a readable tuition letter which shows students, based upon a 10-year repayment plan, what they can be paying a month. Perhaps Charisse would have seen that letter and been like, wait a minute, I'm getting college for X amount in community college and Y amount if I go this. There's just not enough information out there, and I think Seth kind of said it in his thing. Students just sort of accept it as a necessary evil, and we're failing these students because we're not giving them the information necessary.
I'm happy to also talk about free or debt-free college. So I have been, let me use this one, I think. Just use two mics. I have been talking fairly tirelessly about debt-free college for the past 5 years. So I think there are some real interesting, criticisms might be too strong, but sort of critiques of tuition-free plans like Excelsior, right? That the way they sort of work is at the state level often is they will say, okay, you file for financial aid, you get your Pell Grant, you maybe get a TAP, scholarship if it's New York, or your state grant aid, and the state will kick in the last dollar to make tuition free for you. So low-income students already get, some Pell Grants, some other aid, so there's not much left to cover tuition, but at that point they've exhausted all their financial aid, right? They can't use it for living expenses, so in a high cost of living area, like say maybe Manhattan, there's still a pretty huge financial burden. And Charisse in the video mentioned that she took on loans or she dropped out of school because of living costs. We know that at community colleges, living costs make up 80% of the cost of going. So I've been a big advocate of switching to at least a frame of saying we need to make sure that people can go to college without debt, rather than just saying we need to make tuition free. I think tuition free is sort of a square and rectangle situation, right? Like tuition free gets us, part of the way there, and they can be really boldly and progressively designed. I think that the federal government needs to step in and help states and institutions that have been disinvesting in students for the better part of 30 or 40 years to make this happen, but it's definitely possible. And we've seen in some states that have done free community college going rates have gone up pretty significantly. Tennessee, under a Republican governor, did a free community college program. They saw college going rates go up by 10% after staying stagnant for years and years. So there's a lot of potential, but the policy design matters.
And so I think the big issue on this, Mark knows a million times percent more than I do on this, but is I think we're just getting the cost all wrong, right? I think you always see, can we afford this? And I think the problem is we really haven't documented the cost of the student debt crisis now. Like I think you're starting to see more and more research that shows the individual household impact. So this is what everyone cites about inability to buy a home, or less wages, less retirement savings. But I think what really helps change the debate, what we're starting to see, is the societal impact. So on the same day the Federal Reserve released their documentation showing like hundreds of thousands of less houses being built, they also put out a paper documenting the impact of student debt on outmigration of rural counties, right? And I think that's how you start changing the narrative. What we've actually seen throughout the country is some of the most conservative Republican governors in America have actually embraced models maybe less on the free college side, but more on the we need to help student loan borrowers. So the former governor of Maine, like, overtly touted himself as Donald Trump before Donald Trump. He was probably the most fiscal conservative governor in America. Like, he got sued like 7,000 times because he refused to implement Medicaid expansion, just to show you. But he went to war with his own Republican legislature, demanding like $30 million for student loan repayment options. So if you moved into Maine or stayed in Maine, the state was going to chip in some amount of money to help you pay off your student debt. He never said it this explicitly, but if you read through the lines, it was student debt was an existential crisis to the state of Maine. Like, they just couldn't support the labor market to be like, oh, and by the way, add $300 on top of it, right? And I think when you start thinking about the true cost of debt-fueled higher education, both on individuals and households, that is what we need to compare to the college affordability, the debt-free tuition, the debt-free college models, and we're just pretty far away from having that honest discussion right now.
Before we move on to our last topic, I just wanted to talk a little bit about opportunities to help borrowers at a local level, on the ground, similar to what we saw in the video, with student loan consumer assistance programs. Seth, what are you seeing around the country on that front?
So I think one of the really, really concerning things that we see happening around the country is that there are a whole lot of players out there who view $1.5 trillion in debt as their chance to get rich, right? So I think we've talked a lot about for-profit schools, student loan servicers, education debt collectors. We could go on. But one of the really unfortunate things that we see, and if you're ever on Facebook or Google or listen to the radio, there's like a whole cottage industry of student loan debt relief scams. So these are people that prey on the most vulnerable people in the student debt crisis to make sure they could steal like their last dollar. So all of the programs we mentioned, income-driven repayment plans, public service loan forgiveness, disability discharge, those are all free to enroll. Like, your servicer should be on the ground to help you. They are just not. So what has filled the void are a bunch of just, I won't use the profanity I usually use around this, just some really bad people who will either take your money to get enrolled or just take your money and say you were enrolled, and they are everywhere. And this is something that policymakers have been really struggling to figure out. I know the Assemblyman has a bill to work on this, which would go a long way. But I think that leaves open the possibility for trusted players on the state level to really fill in the gap. And it isn't perfect, and it frustrates me that we're giving hundreds of millions of dollars a year to student loan servicers who should be doing the job, but they're not. And under the current administration, they're not going to be doing it for a while. So I think there is an opportunity to work both in the nonprofit side, and this is some of the work that we've been honored to work with New York City DCA on, is how could you think through how you use trusted partners to help people realize that there are benefits available to them.
And Assemblyman Zebrowski and Senator Thomas, maybe the two of you could weigh in on, it seems like this could potentially be a bipartisan issue that people can get behind, just providing assistance on the ground. Is this something that is possible? What are the challenges with implementing something like this?
In terms of helping borrowers?
The student loan assistance programs.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we need to be able to effectively regulate it. So the bill that Seth talked about is just, these borrowers that kind of start to fall behind, and not only they may be preyed upon by the servicers, but then preyed upon by debt relief consultants who also have their own sort of profit margin. And it's just this vicious cycle that borrowers get into. And we really need to come up with a regulatory model so the Department of Financial Services, which is our sort of omnibus financial regulation entity in New York, can ensure that the best interest of the borrower at the end of the day is what these folks have to. It's almost like a fiduciary duty. And when you look at the bills, it's like common sense language, and anybody looks at it, it's like, how is that not the law already? And unfortunately, it's not. But I have a lot of hope that now state government is sort of moving at a rapid pace, and Senator and I hopefully will meet and be able to work on these things in both of our houses to get people on the ground to help folks.
I mean, in addition to oversight and to catch these predators before they strike, we need to fund legal services because it's very important. I mean, we can do as much oversight as possible, but these loans go into default and they come into court, and they need to have someone there in court. 99% of litigants sued in consumer debt, over consumer debt, do not have an attorney. The other side is represented, and when they go into court, they get scared into signing off on the stipulation, basically saying, all right, I'll pay them $500 a month, without actually asking them for the documents. So as a legal services attorney, when I went to bat, I asked them for documents, show me that you actually owe this debt. Now, these student loans are not sitting in a box somewhere, they're securitized, all right? And they kind of shift half their risk to an investor. It's put into this big trust, and when they sue, they have to show us all these documents. They have to show us the chain of custody, and oftentimes they cannot. And that's how I used to get cases kicked out.
In New York City, a couple of examples of things that we've done on the ground to kind of present an alternative to some of these scams or predatory practices. One, we developed tip sheets about what options people have, what they should look at or think about when they're taking on student loan debt, how to avoid student loan debt distress. And this is information that can be found on our website. We deliver. Is it? Oh, some outside, thank you. So tip sheets outside. But in addition to the tip sheets, we've also done what we call student loan debt clinics, which is taking our financial coaching and counseling model and catering it specifically to student loan borrowers. And we did two events, two one-day events, one in the Bronx, one in Brooklyn, both areas where we saw high rates of default and delinquency with student loan debt. And over those 2 days, we served over 100 individuals and had 300 people on the wait list looking for those services. So there's definitely a demand for that assistance and being able to sit down with someone, again, understand what your options are and kind of help walk them through the steps and have some of those conversations with the loan servicers or other individuals, I think is important, and people need that support.
Excellent, thank you. So we've talked a lot about the repair mechanisms to help alleviate these problems, but there is the issue of rising tuition, not enough counseling from universities on the front end, so many types of loans, getting caught up with the wrong private loans. So I thought we could talk a little bit about, and some of our audience questions get at this, so I'm going to use some of theirs. What can be done earlier in the process so we don't land here? Part of this issue is the cost of education. We have a question from an audience member about that says, what forces, market or otherwise, do you believe are driving the increase in the cost of higher education? How do you think we can combat these trends? Anyone?
It's an issue that too often isn't talked about. And I think between 1985 and 2011, tuition costs went up by about 500%, while inflation went up by about 115%. And there's also multiple studies, I think, from the Federal Reserve and a few others that showed, as credit options would increase for consumers, the price of tuition would increase. As student aid would increase, the price of tuition would increase. So it's almost that even if you take about aid, as government provides more aid, the cost goes up. So it's almost like a net even for borrowers, and it's something that absolutely needs to be tackled. I'm glad we're sort of in a CUNY institution, because if we were in a private institution, I might get yelled out of the room for this, but there was an interesting proposal that didn't make it in a prior budget from the governor that sort of suggests if you're going to take students that take TAP, you'd have to keep your cost increases at a higher education index. I mean, that's sort of interesting. If you're going to be taking subsidies and students that take subsidies from the government, we're trying to help these students through TAP loans. Well, you can't just, if TAP goes up, you raise your tuition. How does that help the student? And those are the type of things where I think government is going to have to start having real difficult discussions with even our institutions.
I'm happy to just note on the rising price. So what used to happen was that your state would kick in, whether you're New York or California or wherever, would kick in about 75% of the cost of educating you at a public school. That was 25 years ago. This was not long ago. And tuition would maybe make up a quarter of the rest. States, for the most part, not every state, there are 50 different state systems, but states, for the most part, have continually disinvested at a time when the student pool has gotten more diverse. That is a huge problem. And that is one of the main drivers of tuition increases at public institutions is state disinvestment. New York's per student funding has basically been flat for the past 25 years. Medical costs are another thing that's making tuition rise. There's all kinds of sort of labor-intensive costs of running a college or university. CUNY, to its credit, is cheaper than most, but certainly has seen tuition increases. But at the end of the day, if we're going to have public goods in this country, we're going to have to invest in those public goods, and we used to do that. And I would argue that if we have the political will, we should be able to do it again.
So I think one of the really interesting things that I've been trying to wrap my mind around is how did we allow this state divestment to happen, right? And I harped a lot on the idea around this thing called the college wage premium, which is like how much more is a college graduate going to make compared to someone who doesn't go to college. And where I live, like in DC, this is like the metric that defines all of higher education logic and policy. It is the grounds by which everyone has explained away the loan profile, the increase in the loan program, which is, what is an extra $5,000 or $20,000 or $25,000 or $100,000 in debt when you're going to make this magical $1 million, right? Like you will pay it back. So I think this is very bad for students because I don't think it's honestly true, where most of the spread that gets you to that $1 million isn't because college-educated lives, the lives of college graduates hasn't gotten any better. It's actually kind of remained quite stagnant in terms of wage growth. It is that the bottom has fallen out of the college-educated workforce in America. So the entire spread is essentially not because any college graduate life is better, it's because everyone else's life has gotten worse. But what I think it also does is kind of gives a narrative that allows state policymakers who have faced very tough decisions and tough budget cycles, especially since the recession, as an excuse to cut back on state aid, right? Are we going to cut back on Medicaid and, cut back on nursing homes? Are we going to fix potholes? Are we going to fix bridges? Or are we going to invest in higher education? And I think when we keep thinking about the college wage premium as the only metric, it becomes really easy to cut back on higher ed because what's an extra $1,000? What's an extra $5,000? Because that's just going to cut into your $1 million and you're all going to be fine. And I think until we kind of shift the narrative around what the true cost of debt finance education is, we are going to continue to see that problem and that driving of the disinvestment, which is a huge factor in the tuition increases.
I have two questions that are related, so I thought we'd kind of lump them together. How should we prevent these young student borrowers from overcommitting to the amount of borrowing, and what programs are available to students to inform them about their consumer protections upon taking the loan? They do have to go through some sort of counseling, but it's wildly inadequate, right? Anybody want to take that? You?
Okay. So I think there's two very different situations, and I'm going to punt some of this to Mark But I think what we've generally heard is that this idea that there's this chronic over-borrowing and people are taking on just too much debt isn't really borne out in the data. I think to the extent that the people I know who I trust who really work on this, the extent to which kind of there is a quote over borrowing isn't to kind of buy fancy stuff. It's because there's a whole bunch of non-traditional students, which are actually the traditional students now, who use their loan money to like keep their parents' heat on or make sure their family has food on the table, which is a whole lot harder problem to solve than telling people they overborrow, but is a lot of the ways in which I think people are using the financial aid they get to just keep the lights on. I think the other thing I would just flag on that is generally what we have heard is that this idea that there is like some opportunity for belt tightening when you get your financial aid letter like might be true for some folks. But what we generally heard from in my old job when we would talk to people about why they took on the debt was because that was the only choice. It wasn't really like this teachable moment where they could have like downgraded their lives or got a less fancy condo, right? It was, am I going to go to school or not? And the only choice was give me all of the money because that's what it costs now. And I think there's been this unfortunate push in Washington to kind of put the onus of the student debt crisis on kind of the avocado eating toast meme, which I just don't think is actually true. And I don't think the data really bears that out.
Just to quickly add, I think one of the panelists mentioned the standardized financial aid award letters, but just again, presenting information in a simple and clear way that folks understand it when they're weighing their options and looking at what opportunities are available to them. So we've heard that different schools, different institutions present loans in different ways, using different wording, some leading borrowers to believe or students to believe that it's actually a grant or it's not a loan. So I think starting out with just clear and accurate and transparent information, one of the ideas being to have standardized financial aid award letters is one thought.
One person, I have a quick response for this, and then anybody else can weigh in. How can I find out more about the public loan forgiveness program? Is there a statute of limitations on it? Can non-payment of student loans prevent you from employment via job searching when they do background checks? Just for maybe some depressing, although there are happy endings as well, reading, I encourage you to Google Ron Lieber, who's written extensively about this, from the New York Times, my colleague, and he's tracked success stories and then, thousands of borrowers that are still knocking their head against the wall and trying to make it happen. So to start, I would highly encourage Googling Ron Lieber of the New York Times to get to some grounding on where things stand now. Anybody else want to weigh on that? Can non-payment of...
So I think on the public service loan forgiveness program, I haven't checked in a while, but I think our old employer still has some pretty useful tools at consumerfinance.gov around whether or not you're eligible, if you have questions, the type of things you should be asking your servicer. So I would encourage anyone who thinks they might be eligible or thinks they are eligible to kind of check in and make sure that you are, and if not, have a talk with the New York Attorney General's office or hopefully DFS pretty soon after these guys get their bill passed. I think the other question is, unfortunately, I think the answer is yes. In the overwhelming majority of states, employers can still use a credit check for purposes of employment decisions. So there's unfortunately kind of a vicious cycle where if people go into default, that could impact their employment, meaning impacting their ability to pay their student loan and kind of get on the hamster wheel. So unfortunately, that one I think continues to be true, where the credit decisions can be used in employment purposes.
This is
Not in New York?
Yes.
Okay, good for New York.
This is for Senator Thomas and Assemblyman Zabrowski. What is the hope or likelihood of expanding New York State funding for higher education legislation, including expanding the income max ceiling for TAP, expanding Get on Your Feet loan forgiveness, and expanding beyond the stated $27 million for the Dreamers Act?
So in terms of the TAP ceiling, I think we have, there might be some positive hope there that it can increase during the budget negotiations. That's all I have to say on that.
Right. I would agree with that. I think the Excelsior program is slated to continue to increase, and we need to continue to expand that program in ways that, I would agree, it does not include, it's not bad, but it doesn't include room and board, and that's like, it's half in a way. So let's be honest with folks. Let's not act like it's, suddenly back to a completely free tuition. But budgets are about priorities, and we need to make higher education funding and providing assistance to student loan borrowers a priority, just like other parts of the budget are a priority.
We have another question. What more can you say about private student loans? Where's the protection for us? What will have to move for them to be more regulated? What will have to move for them to be more regulated?
Well, as someone who dealt with private student loans at work, they give out these super high interest rate loans. We need somehow to, this only the federal government can do because of the National Bank Act, where they say, all right, if it's a student loan, the interest rate should be capped at X. It should not be like 11, 12, 13%. When we give out a student loan, we are trying to take care of the future leaders of this country. All right, those are our children. We're trying to make sure that they have a proper education, and to give out a loan at such high interest rates is just horrible. Second, these student loans are securitized. All right, and the reason why they securitize is because they can unload half of their risk, and it's then invested in other countries, etc. That's one of the reasons why there's so much pushback in terms of forgiving these federal student loans. There's a maturity date. You're telling the banks, you're telling these Wall Street investors, hey, whatever you invested in, too bad. You don't get any more money. So we need a different way of giving out these loans. The Treasury note rate is like, 1%? We should be giving out loans to kids at such low interest rates if we are to do that. We need some way of regulating these private student loan companies from the start. We need to educate children. We got to show them, hey, if you're borrowing this is how much it's going to cost at the very end, and this is when your repayment starts. They need to be educated on this in the very beginning. And I don't remember when I took out my loans, but I do know my financial aid officer was just like, sign here, initial here, sign here, initial here, goodbye. That's not the way we should be doing things. But unfortunately, that's a reality on the ground.
And I think just to echo on that, I think we certainly spend a lot of time dealing with private student loans, and I think a lot of the worst abuses in the private student loan market are also kind of transcend to the servicing side, and I think the bills that these folks are pushing would be a critical tool. There is a servicer which services all of the loans that the senator has been talking about, which have been securitized, sold, and lost, and giving DFS the authority to kind of get in there and figure out what is happening would be crucial. Just to go back to an earlier question in terms of like how bad it is and how brazen the servicers are. So the entity that actually services the National Collegiate Loan Trust is an entity called PHIA, the Pennsylvania Higher Education Assistance Authority. They are a quasi-arm of the Pennsylvania government, or at least they pretend to be. They currently service $450 billion of student loan debt. That's 1 out of every $10 of non-mortgage debt in America that flows through this entity. And what's remarkable about them is they run around the country and argue that no laws apply to them. So they have now argued in federal and state court that no State Consumer Protection Act applies, no state licensing law applies, no federal consumer law applies, the Federal Whistleblower Act doesn't apply. They've even argued the Fair Labor Standards Act doesn't apply to their own employees. And I think for years this has just been kind of like flown under the radar for a lot of folks. But it is one of the reasons why the problem, especially in the private student loan market, has gotten so bad. And we need more folks on the ground looking at companies like that, like with the tools and resources of DFS, because the senator's work was like heroic on the individual cases and literally saved people's lives and got probably $100,000 of debt discharged. But there needs to be systemic ways to kind of go after these companies as well.
The amount of money students are granted is heavily influenced by family household income, which further perpetuates the financial disparities. Has there been any discussion about creating metrics to determine the allocated aid? Anyone? Okay.
Would you repeat the question?
Sure. The amount of money students are granted, maybe we're talking about the expected family contribution. The amount of money students are granted is heavily influenced by family household income, which further perpetuates the financial disparities. Has there been any discussion about creating different metrics to determine how to allocate aid?
Well, if I'm not answering the question, I'm going to answer the question I want to answer. So, if it's about sort of, so the way we determine financial aid is you fill out this monstrous bureaucratic form, the FAFSA. The reason we have that form is because we have somehow decided as a society. We don't do this with K-12 education. If the water stops at senior year of high school, right? That's free unless you choose to go to a private high school, right? But you go to your local public school and it's free. We somehow have decided in 13th grade that we need to determine all of your family income, wealth, every thing you're supposed to, like every little crumb of a penny under your couch. And determine what you can expect to pay for college. And we spit out this figure called the expected family contribution. Now, no one actually believes the expected family contribution is meaningful to them. It says like, oh, you can afford $25,332 a year for college. Okay, that's a meaningless number for people. What it is a rationing mechanism. There's a bunch of people for whom there's an expected family contribution of 0 if you are on a public assistance program, if you make not enough money, and that's how it's decided that you get a Pell Grant or get financial aid. A lot of state financial aid programs use that. So for governmental purposes, it's okay if we're going to means test programs, but I think in terms of adding a level of bureaucracy to people's lives, in terms of making the process even more opaque for people, we should probably just do away with the form and make it so that we look at maybe one metric of your family financial picture and say you have basically free or debt-free college, and then maybe other people have to pay a little more or work their way through a little bit. The level of bureaucracy and complication that we have has actually stunted people's college ambitions and prevented people from going when the whole point was to get more people into the process. I have no idea if that answered the question at all.
How much of the problem with servicers is their intent to maximize profits, and how much is unqualified and untrained workers?
Tough to qualify a percentage, but I think the studies show that both. Some of it we would suggest is about maximizing profits, but you can do just as much harm to a student if you intend to put them in the wrong repayment plan, or if you do it because you're just an untrained employee. Perhaps the level of blame isn't the same, but the level of hurt to the student is the same. Which is why if we had a robust regulation mechanism from the states, we could ensure that the right things happen.
This one's directed to Kavya. How confident are you that current statistics of over 1.5 trillion capture the true scope of the problem? With so many loans in default and large penalties and fees associated with curing your loans, where do you turn for the most reliable data?
I think this is a particularly tricky question because there isn't honestly a lot of data that is available, and data shortages is actually a huge part of the student debt conversation as well. Because we're not able to really characterize what so many parts of the student debt crisis look like, we're not able to make confident estimates about things. And for example, in the Mapping Student Debt Project, it's relying on Experian credit statistics, which is brought from the Experian Credit Agency. And the level of certainty and the level of reliability around these credit statistics themselves is pretty poor, just given all of the different caveats of the methodologies that they use to aggregate this data. So I am confident in the fact that there is $1.5 trillion of student debt, but when getting into the granularity of the data and how it's affecting localities in a very specific way, it's difficult to actually characterize that. And without the data from the Department of Education, I think we all struggle as researchers to make meaningful statements and really identify who the communities are who are struggling the most. And so without access to data from Department of Education and other sources, I think that we'll continue to struggle and not really be able to assess some of the key points that the panelists have raised here today.
I think just a quick note to push the bill one more time. I think this is another key piece of having states be involved, right? I think I've been at this for a while, and I think the plan has always been let's grow the coalition to push ed to release better data. And I think you can get a room like this filled with people asking them, and they just wouldn't care. And I think the state having the ability to oversee the servicers and the other players that are central focus can also get better access to data to figure out what's actually happening on the ground in New York. I think on the other data piece, New York City's DCA stuff, if you haven't seen it, you guys should really look at it. It is, I think, really kind of one of the most impactful pieces of research that has been out there, documenting how, student loan debt, when you pull it down to the census tract, I got that wrong, I know, but just shows that the impact that student debt is having is so acute in certain communities that I think it really helps change the narrative that we've all been talking about with, this is just this gateway to the middle class that can never be questioned.
And we have a question at the microphone.
Is it on? Can you hear me? Okay. Hi.
Hi.
Good evening, everyone. Raul Rodriguez. I'm the director of the Office of Community Partnerships at District Council 37, the largest municipal union in New York City. First, I wanted to say thank you to CSS for putting this forum together, and thank you for all the panelists for participating. And I can speak for my executive director when I say we will partner with all of your efforts, because we are one of the few unions that actually has put together a curriculum to show our members the difference between all of the income-driven repayment plans and how they work and how they can benefit them in the immediate situation that they're in. Also, we cover the public service loan forgiveness, and in collaboration with our municipal employee legal services, which one of the representatives is here, my colleague, she can wave. All of our members that have suffered from predatory lending or folks that are just out there charging upwards of $8,000 and telling them that we can lower your monthly loan payments if you just sign this document. And then a year later, they know where to be found. We have our legal services that also assist those members. So we are looking to partner with all of you because, as you know, we have 125,000 members. Okay, so we're a little small. So we are definitely in the fight of fighting the student debt crisis. And one thing that I believe it was Mark, you mentioned about investing in the future. 25% of our population are our kids. But one thing that we know for sure is that they're 100% of our future. So we do have to invest in them. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Do you have a question?
Hi, my name is Aura. I was born in Colombia. I came to this country in 1998. And I graduated from Bronx Science, where I was being recruited by Williams College and the Posse Scholarship at the time. I was undocumented, and I ran away from home and lived in youth shelters where I was able to get special immigrant juvenile status to become a permanent resident. I'm a sophomore here and I'm 26, and I live in the CUNY dorms through EHS. So my expected contribution is 0, and I receive benefits as well. However, none of that takes into account housing. So right now I have $20,000 to pay for a year of housing in the CUNY dorms, half of which was covered by the loans that CUNY offers, but half of that would not be covered at all. So I was able to get through the spring semester last year because that was my first semester, and the loans were clumped into one. But this year, I had difficulty being able to attend this semester. And so it was by the grace of one of the financial aid advisors who sat down with me and explained everything that was going on and submitted paperwork so that all these things could get resolved in a timely manner so that I could attend the semester. So I wanted to share the story because I have been a dreamer. I have seen how things have changed, and I'm very thankful to be in college now because I remember what it was like 10 years ago and what it was like for my sister to attend college. But I wanted to share that story with you guys, especially since the DREAM Act was passed recently for New York students. And a lot of those people that you see, I started with them when I was 16, 17, with the New York State Youth Leadership Council. Angie now, who is the co-founder, I started with her on our first workshop in the summer and our first hunger strike in Schumer's office and our first trips to DC. So I just wanted to share with you guys that, and also just get advice because, like I said, it's very hard to navigate the financial aid system, especially here. And I really don't know what to do moving forward.
I just want to say thank you for sharing your story.
Yeah.
I don't care what anyone says. That is the most American story I can possibly think of, and you are why I do this work. So thank you very much. I just want to say that you mentioned, sort of tuition being able to be brought down. Your financial aid expected family contribution was 0. The hurdles we have still as a society and as a system put in your place just to do the things you should be doing, you have done everything right to this point, I think is unconscionable. And this is why I would go back to the frame of debt-free college being, I think, a really noble and frankly necessary end goal for this conversation. I totally agree with Seth that we need to take care of the 1.5 trillion. We need to take care of the 44 million borrowers. But the fact is that an entire generation or several generations of people could go to college in this country by working 10 hours a week. That was it. I mean, that's, my parents' generation, right? It's very easy to do that again. It requires political will to do that, but it will require us to consider all of the costs that it takes to go to college. It's not just tuition, it's living costs, it's food, it's car repairs, it's childcare. 25% of college students have a kid of their own. We need to really understand the financial burdens facing people and what's actually preventing them from doing exactly what you're talking about.
Can I just add, I think your story raises another very important point that kind of highlights why we need to address this issue, is that Non-completion is one of the strongest predictors of student loan debt distress and default. And so with your story, thank goodness you were able to find a way to continue your studies, but one could only imagine that you weren't able to find those resources. You had to drop out of school, and so now you have student loan debt, but you're not in school, and you don't have the degree and the wage premium that could go with that. So it definitely highlights that we just need a solution to this issue.
So good evening. My name is Annette Bartel. I am on two sides. I'm Maria, the story that was told, but I'm also a representative of State Senator Leroy Comrie. So I'm listening from the legislative, on one side is the legislative side, and then the other is the Maria that I am. But I just wanted to say this, first of all, thank you for all the research, the data, and all the things that the stories and reports that you shared. At the same time, it's almost painful to keep hearing about the disparities and inequities and the experiences that many of us have with predatory lending and the like. I'm going to be honest with you, I was trying to hold back tears because, like the young lady there, if I told you my story, I probably would close this whole evening out, and maybe I'll get a chance to share it on a one-on-one basis without, sparing everyone else the burden of that story because it's very painful. But I just want to ask, what are we doing right now? We know we have to, consider legislation and, craft bills and so forth. But what are we doing right now for people like myself and millions that are currently faced with, the constant increase of that outstanding debt, moving from the original principal to loads of fees and penalties and the like that move from, say, a $20,000 debt to a $50,000 debt with almost, it seems as though $30,000 in fees and penalties. And then, so what are we doing to kind of halt that? Is there anything we can do to halt that process? And then just one other thing, and then also, is there anything we can do right now to, like you addressed, Mark, to deal with that FAFSA? Because one year when I was filing through my CPA who was doing my taxes, he threw something out that I didn't really understand what he was talking about, but he said the FAFSA form itself, the questions asked cause you to disqualify from, government support, which leads you to needing more, loans. So can we address that at some point? Again, I'm sure that's a lengthy conversation as well.
Yeah,
So
this
those
is,
two things.
we are running out of time, so we'll make this our last question. But who,
So those two things.
from Mark, maybe?
So I wish I had a more satisfying answer for that. I mean, I think, so a lot of what we discuss is quite depressing, right? $1.5 trillion, 8 million people in default. I'm trying to figure out how you land the plane better to not have everyone kind of mope out of here. And I think a lot of it is around like basic organizing and sharing all of these stories. Because I hate to say it, I think this is not the common perception that the policymakers in DC have. Like it's been remarkable to me traveling the country talking about this issue. There are many places where DC is out of touch. I think this is probably like exhibit A, because what we hear is like, this is good debt, like this isn't a problem. To the extent people are talking about it, I was like flipping about the avocado toast thing, but a lot of people view this as like a personal responsibility issue. And I think that even with kind of some of the discussions happening around kind of rethinking, reauthorizing the Higher Education Act, this is not on many people's radar screens. And I think we are about to, or we have started embarking on this kind of uniquely American, like every 4-year discussion in terms of presidential elections, in terms of like what matters and what do we expect. And the advice I've been kind of giving everyone, now that I'm not a government employee and can say what I want, is like, make people like come to forums like this. There's going to be 700 candidates or something, right? And make them tell you how they are going to address student debt, right? I think you will probably be fascinated. Some of the answers will be good. You will see that a lot of people probably have not thought about this, but I think it's a uniquely interesting time because folks like Mark and I in Washington are kind of still thought of as outside rabble-rousers, right? I think, and I think what's reassuring is like hearing these stories that like we are right, that like student debt is hampering an entire generation, is hurting communities, and that just needs to cut through, I think, to the kind of general politics, and it needs a lot of really courageous people. I've been doing consumer finance for a while, and it's hard to get people to tell their stories about this stuff, but it's critically important.
I have one really quick question, because it really wasn't a format for questions, I didn't think. How do I get the Department of Education to apply my monthly payments to the principal and not just the interest?
So we should talk because you're currently not able to do that. I mean, so currently the laws and the regs are designed that if you have outstanding fees, that's where your money goes first. If you have outstanding interest, that's where your money goes first. And I think it's part of a much larger discussion about the impact of interest, capitalizing interest, loans, debt-fueled education, because that your story is a lot of what we've heard, which is I'm making payments and my balance never ever goes down.
So I'm going to pay this until I die.
We should I don't want to say yes. Well, let's just talk. We'll talk after.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We've run out of time, but thank you all for coming. There's a lot of technical questions that are left, some personal finance related, so feel free to come up and chat with us after. But thank you for coming. Bundle up.